1989, a classmate of mine was found murdered and raped. Peekskill was a small city with a population of approximately 25,000 people. Murders were very rare. So when this murder happened, it understandably created an atmosphere of fear, rumor, paranoia. Parents were concerned with their own safety as well as the safety of their children. In high school, I was quiet. I was to myself. I didn't participate in very many organized sports. This made me seem strange to the kids in the high school. In the course of the police investigation, the police interviewed many students from the school. Some of those students told the police that they might want to talk to me because I seemed strange to them. This is what the police said initially attracted them to me. The other factor which they said attracted them to me was they claimed that I was overly upset at the victim having been murdered. Yet there were mental health facilities set up all throughout the city of Peekskill to help people process what had happened, again keeping in mind that murders were very rare. For about 6 weeks, the police played this game with me in which our interactions took on the following dynamic. Half the time they would talk to me as if I was a suspect, while the other half the time they would talk to me as if they needed my help to solve the crime. They would say things like, "The kids won't talk freely around us, but they will around you. Let us know if you hear any rumors." They would ask me opinion questions and then congratulate me on my opinion. They would tell me stop in from time to time. Eventually, they got me to agree to take a polygraph test, telling me that there was some new information in the police file that they wanted to share with me, but that the only way they could do that would be if I took and passed the polygraph examination. So the next day, rather than report to school, I instead went to the police station for this test, thinking that it was going to happen at the police station, as I had heard had happened during other polygraphs in connection with this case. Instead, they drove me to the town of Brewster, which was in Putnam County, whereas I was a native of Peekskill in Westchester County. It was 40 minutes away. The significance of my sharing that with you is that meant I was no longer able to leave on my own. I was instead dependent upon the police. They put me in a small room. I did not have an attorney present. I wasn't given anything to eat the entire time I was there. There were 3 police officers there who I knew were police officers, and then there was the polygraphist, who actually was a Putnam County Sheriff's investigator dressed as a civilian who was pretending not to be a cop. I never learned of his status. They strapped me to the polygraph machine, and before beginning the polygraph examination, they gave me countless cups of coffee, the purpose of which was to get me nervous. So after about 20 minutes of pretending to align the machine with the biofeedback of my body, the polygrapher then begins interrogating me using third-degree tactics. He invaded my personal space. He raised his voice at me. He kept asking me the same questions over and over again. As each hour passed, so too did my fear increase in proportion to the time. Towards the end of the examination, the polygrapher made a statement. He said, "What do you mean you didn't do it? You just told me through the polygraph test result that you did. We just want you to verbally confirm it." When he said that to me, that really shot my fear through the roof. At that point, who should make his grand appearance other than the police officer who was pretending to be my friend? He informed me that the other officers were going to harm me, but that he was holding them off, but could not do so indefinitely. You have to help yourself here, you understand. Considering that I had maintained my innocence for the previous 6.5 to 7 hours, it was clear what he meant by that. They wanted me to confess. When it was added that if I did as they wanted, not only would they stop what they were doing, but that I could go home afterwards, being young, naive, frightened, 16 years old, not thinking about the long-term implications, just being concerned with my safety right then, right there, in fear of my life, painfully conscious of the fact that I knew that nobody knew where I was. And then with this push-pull dynamic of, on one hand, the officer is threatening me with harm, but on the other, he's throwing me this false life preserver, telling me that I'm not going to be arrested. Being totally overwhelmed emotionally and psychologically, I took the out which they offered, and I made up a story based upon information which they had given me in the course of their interrogation. By the end of the interrogation, I was on the floor in a fetal position, crying uncontrollably. Needless to say, I was arrested. I was charged with a murder and rape. This is what I looked like when I was charged. Now, before I went to trial, the results of a DNA test came in from the FBI lab, showing that semen found in the victim did not match. But rather than acknowledge they made a mistake, they instead continued to prosecute full speed ahead. The prosecutor got the medical examiner to commit fraud and to commit perjury by falsely telling the jury that he found medical evidence to show that the victim, a 15-year-old immigrant from Colombia who'd been in the country for a mere year and a half, leading a really sheltered life in which she never went outside, save accompanied by her older sister or her parents, that she had been sexually active, which is what opened the door for the prosecutor to argue that it didn't matter that the DNA didn't match me because the semen could have come from consensual sex. Basically, in order to wrongfully convict me, the prosecutor was willing to trash the reputation of the victim who had lost her life. My defense attorney was terrible. He never called as a witness my alibi. I was actually playing wiffle ball at the time that the crime happened. He never cross-examined the medical examiner. He never explained to the jury the significance of the DNA not matching me. He never used the DNA to argue that this so-called confession was coerced and false. And when I wanted to take the stand to explain to the jury that the cops had threatened me and given me the false promise, which they had conveniently left out of their testimony, my attorney wouldn't allow me to testify. He told me rather naively that it wasn't his job to prove that I was innocent, that instead it was up to the prosecution to prove that I was guilty, and he didn't think that happened. That's a naive legal maxim that you might hear in a law school, but in reality, if you find yourself charged with a crime you didn't commit, you better do everything you can in your power to prove that you're innocent, or else you run a risk of being wrongfully convicted. Now, before the jury verdict came in, one of the jurors sent out a note asking whether or not the jury would be sequestered over the Christmas holiday if they couldn't reach a vote, if they couldn't reach a unanimous decision. By that point, I didn't know at the time, but I've learned since, that the count was 11-1 for conviction. But the holdout juror was convinced of my innocence. But upon learning that they would in fact be sequestered over the Christmas holiday, out of expedience, he switched his vote so that they could rush out of there and get to Christmas dinner. And meanwhile, I got home 16 years later as a result of that decision. I'd like to share with you what it is I looked like just before they reached a verdict. That's me in the courtroom. They had announced they reached a verdict, but the actual decision hadn't been reached. And obviously, I'm praying that it went the right way, which it did not. This is what I looked like when I was sentenced to a term of imprisonment of 15 to life. I want to share with you that when I was convicted, I felt like I was in some sort of nightmarish alternative reality, because to my way of thinking, at least up until that point in time, only the guilty were convicted. Yet they said what they did, and I was taken into custody. On the day of the sentencing, I begged the judge to overturn the verdict because I was innocent, and I referenced the DNA to support my contention. He actually told me on the record, maybe you are innocent, conceding that there was a doubt. That didn't lead him to step up for justice, though, and exercise his discretion by overturning the conviction. He instead took the easy, politically expedient way out, which was to sentence me to a term of imprisonment of 15 to life. I'd like to share with everybody just a super short glimpse of what it was like to be in prison. It was very violent there. There were stabbings and cuttings every day, plenty of violence that did not involve weapons. There were a lot of gangs. The food was terrible. Often it wasn't fully cooked, and while at other times it was burned. One time I nearly lost my life because I got hit on both sides of my head near the temple repeatedly with 10-pound weight plates because the inmates thought that I was a rapist since I had been convicted. I'd like to share with everybody how it was that I came to be proven innocent. I naively thought that the higher up in the court system one went, the more accurate that the rulings became. I was soon disabused of that. I went to the first court in which my lawyer argued my innocence based on the DNA not matching me and that my Fifth Amendment rights had been violated. The court found nothing wrong with the way I'd been questioned, and furthermore, they wrote that there was overwhelming evidence of guilt, which I really still don't understand that ruling to this day because the DNA didn't match me. They ruled against me 5-0. I never, after that point, received a substantive ruling on the merits. My lawyer moved to re-argue the case in front of them, but the re-argument motion was denied. The Court of Appeals, my state's highest court, declined to give me permission to appeal to them, so I lost there as well. Then I lost in federal court because the court clerk gave my lawyer the wrong information regarding the filing procedure, and the fact that my petition was 4 days too late was judged to be more important than the fact that I was arguing my innocence, and therefore I lost there as well. I challenged that ruling in front of the Federal Court of Appeals, where the judge there was future United States Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. She saw fit to uphold that ruling not once but twice, and then the United States Supreme Court declined to give me permission to appeal to them. That marked the end of my appeals and the end of legal representation. I wrote letters for the next 4 years trying to find a lawyer and an attorney and an investigator who would take my case for free, for neither I nor my family had any funds with which to hire one. Unless I could come up with some previously unknown evidence of innocence, the court was no longer willing to hear from me. So after writing letters for about 4 years and very rarely getting any responses, I then got turned down for parole by the parole board, in part because of the fact that I asserted my innocence rather than expressing remorse and taking responsibility. It was at that point that I felt fairly certain that I was going to die in prison for a crime that I did not commit. In the end, the Innocence Project agreed to represent me. By this time, the district attorney who had fought all of my efforts at appeals and in getting further testing had left office, and her successor voluntarily allowed me to have further testing. They took the crime scene DNA evidence, which already didn't match me, and compared it to the data bank, and it matched the actual perpetrator. My conviction was reversed, and I was exonerated. I'd like to share with you a brief photo of my being released. It was very difficult to put my life back together again after that traumatic experience. I had to learn new technology. Cell phones, GPS, these different methods of banking, the internet didn't exist. I had to put together relations with my immediate and extended family, for they had become strangers to me. The culture was much different. I had lost track of all my friends, and so I had to try to rebuild a social circle, except that proved rather difficult because while I did spend 16 years in prison wrongfully, yes, I did spend the 16 years there, how much of that actually rubbed off on me? Is it safe to be around me? I was never able to obtain gainful employment because I didn't have the same level of job experience that other applicants had, and so I was always passed up. Combining that fact with the fact that when one is released, you're released with nothing, I struggled greatly. I very nearly ended up into a homeless shelter, and I was not above putting cereal in a bowl and putting it on a backpack if I had to travel for about an hour because I had no funds with which to purchase anything to eat. This photo I'm going to share with you is an accurate depiction of my struggles post-exoneration. I saw mental health and still see mental health professionals in dealing with the psychological after effects of my experience. I'd like to share with you briefly, as illustrated by my case, what are the things that lead to wrongful conviction? Well, coerced false confessions have been the cause of wrongful convictions in 25% of the cases. What would lead an innocent person to confess? A lengthy interrogation coupled by food deprivation, threats and false promises. Particularly vulnerable populations are youth and those with mental health problems. What is the solution? Let's videotape interrogations from beginning to end. It would make clear if a suspect was coerced, whether they really knew non-public facts, whether the police engaged in threats and false promises. It would protect honest cops from false allegations of coercion, and it would make for better evidence. Basically, it's a win-win. What's the pushback? Well, costs for the recording equipment are cited, which is ridiculous because when you think about how much money is spent on the back end through having to defend lawsuits and make large payouts by way of compensation, it pays for itself if you stop just one case. We have to have an oversight board, a commission on prosecutor conduct, so that can investigate and punish prosecutors who engage in clear-cut, intentional misconduct. Right now, there's nothing. What is the pushback? Prosecutors claim that politically motivated false charges will be leveled against them. But just as a society, we would never consider repealing rape out of concern that some people might be falsely charged and convicted of it, and we would not entertain that argument to repeal it. So too should we not listen to the prosecutors who want the rogues amongst their profession to continue to get away with it. We need to have a better system of public defense for the poor. Both sides need to receive more resources so that they can focus more on cases, but then there needs to be a manpower and financial parity between the two. We need to limit the caseloads because it's not unusual for one public defender to simultaneously represent 100 people at the same time. We need to have one statewide system so that there could be oversight and quality control. What is the actual percentage of people who are wrongfully convicted? Well, considering that the National Registry of Exonerations, which documents wrongful convictions, has documented from 1989 forward more than 1,600 wrongful convictions, and that a Wayne State University study estimates 10,000 new people are wrongfully convicted each year, and that there's articles that say that as many as 120,000 people are wrongfully convicted, I would say that the wrongful conviction percentage is 15 to 20%. In order to address the issue, I started an organization called the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation for Justice, named after me, committing $1.5 million to be a part of the overall effort towards fighting wrongful convictions through trying to prevent that from happening, through raising awareness and seeking changes in the law, working to exonerate the wrongfully convicted, and helping exonerees back into society. I'm here because of the great work of the Innocence Project, but they're not the sole answer. For one thing, they don't have unlimited resources. For another, they'll only take on cases that have DNA in it, which is only 5 to 12% of the total amount of cases. When I need everybody to assist, think about learning more about wrongful convictions, sharing that information with your friends, your neighbors. Think about supporting some of the organizations in the field doing this critical work. Think about offering pro bono assistance. Think about contacting your elected officials to insist that changes be made to make the system more accurate. When thinking about whether or not you wish to take any action at all on any of these levels that I've mentioned, or some more that I'm leaving out, as opposed to this just simply being a memorable TEDx talk that you talk about for a day or two and then forget, think about this. I had never been arrested for so much as a violation. I was not a high school dropout. In fact, I was on my way to school at the time in which I was initially intercepted by the police. It happened to me. It could happen to you, your son, your daughter, your neighbor, your best friend. Thank you very much for listening to me.